Camping equipment stores can be a dizzying maze of products. How do you know what you need? The answer to that question will depend on what type of camping you want to do. For example, do you want to car camp, where you drive into a campsite, have to carry your equipment only a few feet, and then can use your vehicle to store extra gear? Or do you want to do ultralight backpacking, where everything you need for a week can fit into a backpack small enough to fit in an airplane's overhead compartment? There's usually a trade-off between weight and comfort or convenience, and the type of camping you want to do will tell you where your gear should fall on that continuum. For example, options for stoves could include a large, freestanding stove that weighs almost 40 pounds, and that's before you add in the large canister of propane. But it has sturdy countertop height legs and will be almost as convenient as cooking at home. Or for about a third of the weight, around 12 pounds, you could choose a 2-burner stove that has no legs and only a small fuel bottle, but can still cook 2 large pots at the same time on a wide and stable cook surface. Or for 1/43 of the weight of the 2-burner stove, only 4.5 ounces, you could choose a miniature alcohol stove, which will be an almost imperceptible addition to your pack, but will require you to carefully balance your one pot on top and perhaps even construct a windbreak out of rocks to keep the flame from blowing out. If I were car camping, I'd consider the freestanding stove. If I were canoe tripping with very few portages, I might take the 2-burner. And if I were backpacking long miles, I'd think about the alcohol mini stove. Perhaps you'll want to be prepared to do several different styles of camping, in which case you might have different sets of gear for each. Or if you want to keep it simple, you could always do what I did in college. Buy gear for the most lightweight and compact type of camping you think you'd like to do, and then just use that gear for everything. When I first started buying gear for camping, I most wanted to do extended backcountry trips, traveling by foot or canoe. The gear I purchased then was lightweight and compact. For example, I had a tiny tent inside of which I could barely sit up, a tiny headlamp as my only source of light, and a stove that folded down to the size of a grapefruit and had only one temperature, very hot, and a chair that consisted of a thin piece of foam. Changing clothes inside the tent was an exercise in contortion. Cooking required squatting by the stove and frantically stirring the pasta to keep it from scorching onto the bottom of the thin metal pot, all the while gripping the pot to keep it from falling off the tiny stovetop. And getting up from my chair was a core body workout. The lack of comfort in camp, however, was, in my mind, a worthwhile trade-off for the benefits while on trail, a light pack, and the ability to get far away from the crowds of people closer to the trailhead. On one particular camping trip, however, my friend and I decided to go to a state park drive-in campground, where we would base ourselves for a few days while we played on a short stretch of whitewater in our canoe. Seeing as I was in college and on a budget, I had only one set of camping equipment, the ultralight set, which now had to do, even though we were car camping. As we huddled around our tiny stove, cooking a packet of rice and beans in the small circle of light thrown by our headlamps, one of the people from a neighboring campsite approached us and said, "You look miserable over here. Would you like to join us for dinner? We're cooking steak." And he motioned to his campsite that had a propane lantern illuminating a dining room with foldable chairs with backs and armrests, a large 2-burner propane stove on legs, a folding table sporting a collection of large cast iron pots and pans, and several coolers. As my friend and I looked from our Spartan camp towards their luxurious one, it wasn't hard for us to decide where we'd like to spend the evening. So I guess one unexpected benefit of using your compact, lightweight gear for every type of camping might be getting invited over to the neighbor's compound for dinner. As I've grown a bit older and have access to more money, I've slowly started to acquire some heavier luxuries like folding chairs, and screen tents for when I go car camping. I still, however, like to get away from the crowds of people near the trailheads, so I keep a set of ultralight gear as well. Once you've decided what type of camping you'd like to do, ultralight and nimble, heavy and decadent, or somewhere in between, the goal is to start to develop a system. I'm always preaching to my students the value of systems for personal gear and for group gear. What I mean by a system is being deliberate about what gear you bring, where you pack it, and how you use it, and working towards doing it the same way every time, within reason. As you reflect on and tweak your systems, you become more efficient, comfortable, and safe. For example, if you always pack your pack in the same way with the same things in the same places, you don't have to worry about forgetting something, and you don't have to struggle every morning to figure out how to make everything fit. You're also more likely to have the appropriate gear for the moment, and that gear is more likely to be in good condition and readily accessible. As an illustration of the difference good systems can make, when I was instructing outward bound canoeing expeditions for teenagers, one particular group struggled with developing and sticking with a system. Every morning, they would have to debate who would pack what gear in their packs, and almost without fail, once everyone's packs were packed, they would notice some large piece of gear that was left out, and they'd have to repack everything. Although it was taking them a couple of hours to pack up camp every morning, they kept resisting our suggestions to develop a system where everyone packed the same thing in the same place every day. My co-instructor and I thought maybe what the group needed was a demonstration of the value of systems. So we told them that the following morning, although they needed to wake up at the same time as always, we instructors were going to sleep in. The group was to wake us up when their packs were packed and they were ready to load canoes to depart. The next morning, when they woke us up, after they'd already been awake for 2 hours, my co-instructor and I sprung into action, stuffing sleeping bags, quickly taking down the tent, and packing everything in its normal place. We were down to the water's edge and putting our packs in our canoes just in time to paddle away with the rest of the group. At lunch that day, the group called a meeting where they decided that everyone would carry the same gear for the remainder of the trip. Morning sped up considerably after that. To begin creating a system for a particular type of camping, you'll of course need to first acquire gear. Even if you are planning on car camping exclusively, I would encourage you to aim for simplicity. Having less gear means not only less expense, but also less time packing, setting up, tearing down, cleaning, and maintaining gear. This is time you can instead spend enjoying relaxing outside. To work towards simplicity, while still meeting your needs, I suggest looking for gear that can do more than one thing. For example, instead of buying a purpose-built lantern, you could create your own lantern by strapping a headlamp to a clear plastic water bottle so its light illuminates from the inside of the bottle and shines out in a cozy glow. Or, instead of buying a firewood tote, how about carrying your firewood inside a stadium chair, which can also be used not only as a chair, but also as an extra sleeping pad or as a pad for kneeling. Instead of bringing a cutting board, could you use a frisbee, which, in addition to being a fun diversion, can also double as a plate? Instead of buying camp pillows, consider folding your extra clothing into a pillow and sliding it inside an extra stuff sack, which doubles as a pillowcase. Rather than bringing a bowl and mug, try bringing just a bowl and, after eating your oatmeal out of it, pouring your coffee into it. The hot coffee will effectively clean your bowl for you, and you'll have one less dish to pack. So, to reiterate, I'd suggest thinking hard before purchasing gear that does only one thing. You could buy a purpose-made solar shower, or you could get an MSR dromedary bag that will not only work as a shower, but will also double as a hand washing station, a water hauler, and even a pillow in a pinch. I do have one caveat to this suggestion, however, and that is to try to avoid gimmicky gear that tries to do too many things, but doesn't do any of them very well. For example, I've never appreciated the plastic sporks that are often in a basket next to the cash register of camping stores. The sporks with the spoon on one end and the fork on the other, with the knife teeth along one side of the fork tines. The tines aren't strong enough to stab anything without breaking. The knife isn't sharp enough to cut anything other than maybe an overcooked noodle. Plus, who can really use a knife without simultaneously needing a fork to pin down the food to be cut? But your fork is already in use as a knife, and the whole time, the remnants of your soup are probably dripping down the handle and coating your hand. Camping stores are full of these types of gimmicky things. A trowel with a compartment in the handle to store toilet paper, a woolen hat with a built-in headlamp, a backpack with a solar panel. Of course, sometimes it takes buying a piece of gear to realize that it's a disappointment, but that is unfortunately part of the learning process. Donating your gear duds to a charity thrift store is a good way to pass them along to somebody who might appreciate them. In addition to aiming for simplicity by looking for gear that can serve multiple purposes, another way to try to decide what gear to buy or bring on a particular trip is the 3 piles method. Arrange all the gear you're considering into 3 piles. 1 pile of absolute necessities, 1 pile of things that would be nice to have, and 1 pile of luxury items. You may be assuming that I'm going to tell you to take everything from the first pile, half of the things from the second pile, and nothing from the third pile. Well, you're right about the first pile. Bring all the necessities. But I may surprise you when I suggest taking nothing from the second pile, the things that would be nice to have, and taking 1 thing from the pile of luxuries. My rationale is, seeing as you don't really need the things in the second pile, you might be happier with the simplicity you'll achieve by leaving them at home or on the store shelves. Imagine how much more time you'll have in camp when you don't have to worry about unpacking all the stuff and setting it up. You could use that time to lie on your back and gaze at the gently swaying treetops. As for the pile of luxury items, remember, we're not out here to rough it. We're out here to smooth it. And if there is an item that will bring you joy, I suggest bringing it. Is it a DSLR camera, a set of watercolors, binoculars, a hammock, or maybe a stovetop espresso maker? Whatever it is, you'll likely appreciate it all the more, given the fact that you're out with just the bare necessities. Of course, if you're car camping instead of backpacking, weight and space aren't as limiting, so you might decide to take more than 1 item from your luxury pile. I won't fault you for that, but I would encourage you to be careful to not go overboard. You don't want to spend too much of your time out there dealing with gear. As you're selecting gear, you'll also need to consider the typical conditions in which you'll be camping: the climate, the bugs, the remoteness, and how long the trips are that you think you'll be doing. If you're planning on doing long trips in remote areas, it'll be especially important that any gear you bring be durable and repairable by you in the field. If you're planning on traveling in places or seasons where biting insects are not a problem, you might decide against buying a standard tent. If there are no bugs, you can manage with just a ground sheet under a tarp for shelter from the wind and precipitation. This will be much lighter weight and more compact than a tent that has walls and a floor. For example, Black Diamond's Mega Light floorless tent, which is really just a pyramidal-shaped tarp with a single pole in the center, weighs only 2 pounds 13 ounces, packs down to the size of a cantaloupe, and can sleep 4 people. It's roomy and lightweight. But if there are clouds of mosquitoes, you'll likely think it's worth the added 3 pounds 11 ounces to buy the Mega Bug insert that gives you a floor with mosquito-proof walls. Your selection of shelter will also depend on your patience for rigging and constructing, or your desire to have something that sets up the same way every time. A freestanding tent can be erected on any surface. It doesn't require even so much as a tent stake to keep it standing, only perhaps to keep it from blowing away. A freestanding tent can just be picked up and moved to a different location if you realize there's a sharp rock right under your back or a dead tree leaning over you. To be freestanding, of course, a tent requires at least 2 poles, which add weight. If, rather than tent poles, you're willing to use your trekking poles or trees in combination with tent stakes or rocks or downed logs to hold up your tent, you can ditch a lot of weight. It's not just bugs and ease of setup that will determine what type of shelter you want. It's also the temperatures and the likelihood of storms with strong winds. To illustrate these differences, we'll continue looking at 4-person tents. It's possible to find 4-person tents that weigh as little as 8.5 pounds. These lighter weight tents are typically 3-season tents. In comparison with a 4-season tent, they have bug netting panels without nylon covers. This will make them less warm in cold temperatures and less likely to be able to keep out blowing snow. They also have a minimum number of full-length poles, which will make them less likely to hold up well in severe storms. For comparison, a 4-season tent will often have nylon panels that can be zipped over any mesh windows, and as many as 5 full-length poles, 3 more poles than the 3-season tent. But this added warmth and strength comes with a cost, an extra 4 pounds, nearly 50% heavier. If you're planning on a winter mountaineering expedition, the extra warmth and strength will be worth the extra weight. But if you're backpacking in warm weather, the 3-season tent will not only be lighter, but also cooler with its large mesh panels. So the decision about what will be the ideal shelter depends on ease of setup, the bugs, and the weather, and balances these concerns against weight. And then, of course, we have to factor in price. As with many commercial goods, you get what you pay for. If you can afford to buy top-of-the-line camping equipment, it will serve you well. Let's continue looking at 4-person tents for an illustration. A 3-season tent from a more high-end manufacturer might retail for close to $400. It will likely have a full coverage rain fly that will keep all the rain off the tent, and its seams will be covered with waterproof tape so it won't leak. Its poles will be made from a particular aluminum alloy chosen for its impressive strength-to-weight ratio and ability to flex under pressure without breaking, much like the wings of an airplane. In fact, the company that makes these high-end aluminum poles has a wind tunnel they use for testing. The tent will also likely have a vestibule or a front porch under the rainfly. This means you can enter and exit the tent in a rainstorm without letting the rain get inside the tent. For contrast, a 4-person tent that you might find in a big box store might cost as little as $89, significantly less expensive than the high-end tent at nearly $400. If money is very tight for you, and you expect to do only occasional weekend trips in areas that are not very remote and not prone to severe storms, the low-end tent might be a good choice. But if you want to camp frequently, or if you plan to venture far away from your car, know that the poles on the low-end tent are fiberglass. Under high wind loads, especially in cold weather, they might splinter. A splintered fiberglass pole is virtually impossible to repair, and its sharp ends could slice your tent or your hands. Also, the rain fly on this low-end tent covers only the very top of the tent, meaning rain will land on the majority of your tent. To try to keep the tent dry, the manufacturer makes the walls of the tent out of the same waterproof material as the fly, but this means the tent walls don't breathe, which will make the tent stuffy in hot weather. And even though the walls are made out of waterproof material, water running down the walls will eventually find its way through seams. And without a vestibule, anytime you open the door of the tent, you'll get rain coming through the door. The materials in the low-end tent are also heavier than those in the $400 tent. Again, if money is very tight for you and you just want to do the occasional car camping, the low-end tent might be a reasonable choice. If, however, you want to camp more regularly and have more versatility, comfort, and security, it's worth buying higher quality gear. If you care for it, a high-quality tent can give you years and years of service. Once you have selected your gear for a particular trip, the next step in creating your system is to think about how you'll pack the gear. You should consider how you'll keep the gear protected yet accessible when needed. I'll talk through my personal systems for backpacking trips as an example. For a backpacking trip, I want to choose the lightest weight gear I have that'll still keep me comfortable and safe in the conditions. In the summer, I might aim for a total pack weight, without food, of under 25 pounds. When I pack my backpack, I'm wanting the pack to be densely packed, so I'm efficiently using all the available space and creating a pack that is well balanced. My visual check for this is smooth sides of the pack without any wrinkles, folds, or gaps, and a pack that stands up on its own without falling over. I'm wanting everything to fit inside the pack rather than attached to the outside. This allows me to duck under tree branches without getting hung up and keeps me from accidentally losing or damaging gear. I know many people who have arrived at camp only to discover that their tent poles, which they had slid into the side pouch on the outside of their pack, are missing, or that their sleeping pad, which they'd strapped on the outside, is shredded. Better to keep everything inside the pack. If I'm hiking in an area with a lot of rain and river crossings, I want to make sure I can keep my sleeping bag and clothing dry. So rather than relying on a pack cover to keep out the rain, I'll choose a pack liner. This way, even if I drop my pack into a stream, my important stuff will stay dry. The only things that go inside the pack liner are things that need to stay dry and that don't have sharp edges that might puncture the pack liner. My tent poles, pots, pans, and trowel go inside the pack, but outside of the pack liner. I pack things into my pack in an order that keeps the things I might need during the day accessible and buries the things I won't need until camp at the bottom. I put my sleeping bag in first. I don't use a stuff sack for my sleeping bag, so it completely fills the base of my pack. The gear that goes on top of it will compress it naturally and avoid leaving the empty spaces and gaps that come along with stacking compression sacks on top of each other. The next thing I'll add is my deflated sleeping pad and my sack of extra clothing layers that I don't expect to need until the evening. If my tent is dry, it goes in next, minus the poles that slide down inside the pack. If my tent is wet from a rainstorm the day before, I'll close up my pack liner before adding the wet tent to my pack. The final things that go inside my pack liner are my food, other than my snacks for the day, and my first aid kit. Once the pack liner is closed, anything that doesn't need to stay dry goes in. I think about keeping heavy items as low and close to my back as possible for stability and comfort. And I try to minimize any gaps and keep things that need to be quickly accessible near the top. It's like playing a game of Tetris. I try to fill any empty spaces. For example, inside my cooking pots, I store my stove, cooking utensils, and stove repair kit. The very last thing I add to my pack is my rain gear. I roll my rain pants and raincoat into a ball and put them right on top of my lunch and just inside the top of the pack. This way, if it starts raining, I can pull out my rain gear without having to unpack anything. In the lid of my pack, I keep a water-resistant stuff sack with things I'll need frequently throughout the day: sunscreen, lip balm, sunglasses, knife, compass, bowl and spoon, bandana, and some ibuprofen. I also keep my headlamp and lighter in here, just to make sure I have them handy when I need them. This water-resistant stuff sack not only keeps my headlamp dry, but also keeps the small things in the lid from accidentally falling out and getting lost. Pouches on the outside of the pack are reserved for things that I don't need to stay dry and that need to be quickly accessible. If I have a pair of extra shoes for use around camp or for stream crossings, I zip them inside the outside compartment where they're not only accessible, but won't get my other gear dirty. I also keep my water bottles in the outside holsters. In my system, Because I know where everything is and pack it in the same way every time, even something a bit deeper in the pack can be retrieved quickly. For example, my first aid kit, which is at the top of the pack liner, takes only a few seconds to grab. My system protects my most important gear and keeps the most frequently used gear accessible. Contrast this with a student of mine who, on an outward-bound mountaineering course in the Alps, despite repeated suggestions to the contrary, insisted on packing his sleeping bag in a compression sack and putting it in the very top of his pack, where he had to remove it to access anything else. One day at lunch, on top of a mountain, he removed the sleeping bag from the pack in order to pull out his lunch. When he set the sleeping bag down, it started to roll and picked up speed, careening off a 1,000-foot cliff before he could catch it. The remaining nights of the trip were a bit chilly for him, I imagine. If you are car camping instead of backpacking, your system will look a bit different, but the underlying goals are the same. Perhaps you'll have a series of Rubbermaid tubs for organizing and protecting your gear. The key is thinking deliberately about how and where things should be packed to be the most efficient, making slight adjustments if needed, and then doing it the same way every time. Hopefully, the dizzying maze of products available in camping stores is now a little less mystifying. There's no one correct system for all types of camping and for all types of people. There's only the correct system for you and your goals. Balance weight and cost with convenience and comfort. Then do a few short, local shakedown trips to fine-tune your systems before heading out on any longer or more remote trips.